The first splinter of autumn light cut across the valley floor, painting the frost on Anya's small cabin in hues of pale gold and rose. Inside, the air still held the night's deep chill, but she was already at work. The rhythmic rasp of her hand saw a lonely prayer in the vast silence. Her companion, a great shepherd dog named Fenrir, lay with his head on his paws near the hearth, his intelligent eyes tracking her every move. He did not question her task, though any other soul in the small settlement of Providence would have. For weeks, Anya had been building a box. Not a chest for storage, nor a cradle for a child she would never have, but something else entirely. It was small, barely long enough for her to lie down in, and just wide enough to accommodate her and the dog. She worked with a quiet intensity that bordered on obsession, using the seasoned pine her late husband, Finn, had stacked behind the cabin years ago. He had always said, "The forest gives you what you need, Anya, but you have to know what to ask for." She was asking for a sanctuary. The work was slow, her hands chapped and sore, but her movements were precise, born of memory and necessity. Each board was measured twice, each joint fitted snugly. She was not just building with wood, she was weaving a shield against a future only she could feel gathering on the horizon. This morning, the sharp rap on her door was an unwelcome intrusion. She set down her saw as Fenrir rose with a low grumble. "Easy, boy," she murmured, wiping her hands on her apron. It was Mr. Hemlock, the proprietor of the town's mercantile, a man whose girth was matched only by his self-importance. He stood on her porch, his face a mask of patronizing concern. "Anya," he began, peering past her into the cabin's dim interior. His eyes fell on the strange construction in the center of the room. "What in heaven's name is that?" His voice was laced with the kind of smug curiosity that passed for neighborliness in Providence. She didn't invite him in. "Just a project, Mr. Hemlock," he chuckled, a wheezing sound that grated on the quiet morning. "A project? Looks more like a coffin for a pony. A bit grim, don't you think?" A woman alone, one must be careful not to let morbid thoughts take root. Anya's face remained impassive. "It's for storage." He didn't believe her, and she didn't care. His gaze swept over her worn dress, the sawdust in her hair. "Well, if you need proper supplies, you know my store has the finest goods this side of the mountains. No need to be building your own furniture." He left with another dismissive laugh, and Anya closed the door, the sound of his judgment echoing in the small space. She ran a hand over Fenrir's head. "He doesn't understand, does he, boy?" The dog leaned into her touch, his warmth a silent affirmation. She picked up her saw. The air was getting colder. The work was not yet finished. The box was Finn's idea, though he had never drawn a plan or hammered a single nail for it. He had given it to her in words, spoken on long winter nights with the fire crackling and the wind howling a mournful song outside their sturdy cabin. He had been a man who listened more than he spoke, and what he listened to was the earth itself. He'd spent decades trapping in the high country, and he understood its language, the subtle shift in the wind's direction, the way the squirrels harvested pine cones with a desperate frenzy, the peculiar stillness that preceded the deadliest storms. "There's cold, and then there's the deep cold," he told her one night, his voice low and serious as he stared into the flames. "It's a cold that doesn't just bite your skin. It gets inside the wood, inside the stone. It finds its way into a man's bones and freezes the hope right out of him. It's a living thing, Anya, and it's hungry." He had seen it once, a storm that had turned a whole camp of seasoned trappers into statues of ice. They had fire, they had shelter, but they didn't have a core. "The fire can die," he'd explained, his hand closing over hers. "The cabin can fail. You have to have a place within a place. A final pocket of warmth. Small enough for your own breath to keep the frost away." He had described it to her then, a small, insulated crate, a human den. Not a coffin, as Mr. Hemlock had sneered, but its exact opposite. It was a womb. A promise of rebirth. After Finn was gone, taken by a fever that burned as hot as the deep cold was frigid, his words remained. They became her inheritance, more valuable than the small plot of land or the sturdy cabin. Now, as she worked, his voice was her guide. She lined the inside of the box with the thickest wool blankets she owned, stitching them into place so they formed a padded cocoon. She packed a small tin with dried venison, hard biscuits, and a block of tallow. She set aside 3 precious candles and a striker. Every item was chosen with a purpose Finn had taught her. The people in Providence saw a grieving widow descending into eccentricity. They saw her hauling extra loads of wood, saw her sealing the cabin's tiniest cracks with mud and moss, and they whispered, "Poor woman. Her grief has unsettled her mind," they'd say in the warm, cluttered confines of Hemlock's mercantile. They felt pity, a distant and useless emotion. They did not feel the change in the air. They did not see the sky, a pale and unforgiving blue. They were deaf to the mountain's warning, a low hum that Anya could feel vibrating deep in her chest. The first sign was the silence. One morning, the boisterous chatter of the jays in the pines surrounding her cabin was gone. The forest, usually a cacophony of rustles and calls, had fallen utterly still, as if holding its breath. Anya stood on her porch, Fenrir's head pressed against her leg, and she scanned the sharp, clear lines of the distant peaks. There were no clouds, but the sky had a hard, metallic sheen to it, a cruel gleam that promised no warmth. Finn had taught her to watch the animals. "They know what's coming long before we do," he'd said. "They don't have calendars or almanacs. They have instinct, and that's truer than any printed page." That afternoon, she saw a herd of elk moving down from the high meadows, their pace urgent, their eyes wide with a primal fear. They were heading for the thickest, most sheltered groves in the low valley, abandoning their prime grazing grounds. It was weeks too early for such a migration. In town, Mr. Hemlock was holding court, leaning against a barrel of crackers in his store. "Just another cold snap coming," he declared to the men gathered around his pot-bellied stove. "Good for business. Folks will be stocking up on blankets and coffee." He gestured with a dismissive wave of his hand. Heard the widow sealed her windows with mud. Like a badger in a burrow. "It's a sad thing, what loneliness can do." A few of the men chuckled, their laughter mingling with the scent of pipe smoke and dried goods. They were comfortable, cocooned in their collective confidence. They saw the world through the narrow lens of their experience, and their experience had never included a storm like the one that was gathering its strength in the frozen heart of the north. Anya felt no anger toward them, only a profound and sorrowful pity. Their arrogance was a thin blanket against the cold that was coming. She spent the rest of the day in a final flurry of activity. She chopped more wood until her muscles screamed, stacking it inside the cabin until one wall was a fortress of split pine. She melted snow and filled every container she had with water, knowing the creek would soon be a solid block of ice. She cooked a large pot of stew, eating a hearty portion and giving the rest to Fenrir. They would need the strength. As dusk fell, the temperature began to plummet. It was not a gradual cooling, it was a sudden, violent theft of warmth from the world. The air grew so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation a sharp pain in her lungs. The stillness broke, replaced by a low, rising moan from the mountains. It was the storm, and it was singing its arrival. The snow began without preamble, not as gentle flakes, but as a hard, granular dust, sharp as sand, driven by a wind that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It didn't fall, it attacked, scouring the landscape horizontally. Anya secured the heavy wooden bar across her door and pushed the thick shutters over the 2 small openings that served as windows, plunging the cabin into a near-total darkness, broken only by the flickering light of her lantern. Fenrir, who normally faced the world with a calm stoicism, paced restlessly, a low whine caught in his throat. He could feel the pressure dropping, the very air in the cabin growing thin and strange. "It's all right, boy," Anya soothed, her voice a small island of calm in the growing tempest. "We're ready." She lit the stove, the cast iron beast that was the heart of her home, and began feeding it the driest lengths of pine. It roared to life, its orange glow pushing back against the encroaching gloom, but she knew it was a temporary victory. The cold was a physical presence now, a palpable weight against the cabin walls. She could feel it pressing in, searching for any weakness, any tiny chink in her defenses. The wind was no longer just a sound, it was a symphony of violence. It shrieked and howled, then dropped to a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like a great beast clawing at the logs, trying to tear its way inside. Outside, the world was being erased. The familiar shapes of the pines, the creek, the woodpile, all vanished into a swirling vortex of white. In town, the initial confidence was beginning to fray. The storm was worse than anyone had predicted. The wind tore at roofs and shattered the carefully sealed panes of the mercantile. Mr. Hemlock, his store now crowded with anxious townsfolk seeking shelter, tried to maintain his bluster. "She's a wild one, all right," he shouted over the din, "but these walls are thick. We'll ride it out just fine." But in his heart, a cold seed of doubt was beginning to sprout. He could feel the temperature dropping even inside his well-stocked fortress, a chill that had nothing to do with the drafts whistling under the door. He thought of the widow, Anya, alone in her small cabin with her strange mud-sealed windows and her morbid wooden box. The image, once a source of amusement, now sparked a flicker of an emotion he couldn't quite name. It felt unnervingly like envy. Anya sat on a low stool, her hand resting on Fenrir's back, and listened. She was listening to the house, to the strain of the logs, the groan of the roof beams. It was a duel between her small, warm world and the vast, frozen rage of the wilderness. Hours bled into one another, each marked by the relentless scream of the wind. The cabin, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now seemed as fragile as an eggshell. The cold was winning. It seeped through the mud-chinked logs, a creeping, insidious presence that the stove fought against with diminishing success. Frost began to bloom on the interior walls, delicate, deadly flowers of ice that grew and spread in the lantern light. Anya had to stay within a few feet of the stove to feel any of its heat. Fenrir had abandoned his usual spot by the hearth and was now pressed against her legs, shivering despite his thick coat. Anya kept feeding the fire, her movements economical and deliberate, conserving her energy. She knew the real test was yet to come. She thought of Finn, wondering if this was the deep cold he had spoken of. She imagined him beside her, his calm presence a balm against the storm's fury. He would not be afraid, she knew. He would be watchful, respectful of the power unleashed upon them, but not afraid. Fear was a luxury, a waste of warmth. The town of Providence was descending into a state of quiet panic. The communal confidence had frozen and shattered. Families huddled in their homes, burning furniture to stay warm as their woodpiles, once thought to be plentiful, dwindled at an alarming rate. At the mercantile, the bravado had evaporated completely. The great pot-bellied stove, though roaring, could not combat the Arctic air flooding the large room. People were draped in blankets and oilskins, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering lamplight. Mr. Hemlock moved among them, his own fear a sour taste in his mouth. His fine, sturdy building felt like a tomb. He had sold these people confidence, and now he had nothing left to offer them but the rapidly diminishing warmth of his fire. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken accusations. He, the pillar of the community, was just as helpless as everyone else. Back in her cabin, Anya was beginning to feel a deep, penetrating weariness. The constant roar of the wind, the oppressive cold, the endless task of feeding the fire, it was draining her spirit as much as her body. She closed her eyes for a moment, leaning her head against the rough-hewn wall, and that was when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a new sound, a sharp, violent crack from above, followed by a wrenching, metallic scream. The sound was catastrophic. Anya's eyes snapped open, her heart seizing in her chest. A blast of impossibly cold air and a swirl of snow erupted from the top of the stove. The stovepipe, the cabin's vital artery of warmth and air, had been torn from the roof by the sheer force of the wind. A torrent of snow and ice cascaded down the flue, hissing as it hit the hot iron and instantly extinguishing the fire. Thick, acrid smoke billowed into the room, choking her. The cabin's heart was dead. In moments, the smoke cleared, sucked out through the new, gaping hole in the roof, but it was replaced by something far worse, the full, untempered fury of the blizzard. The temperature in the small room plummeted. It was no longer a creeping chill, it was a physical assault. The residual warmth was stripped away from the walls, the floor, the very air, in a matter of seconds. Anya could see her breath now, a thick white plume in the lantern light. The frost on the walls thickened instantly, the delicate patterns turning into a solid sheet of white rime. The water in the bucket by the door, which had been liquid minutes before, began to film over with ice. Fenrir let out a sharp bark of alarm, pressing his body hard against hers. She felt the tremors running through him, not of aggression, but of pure, instinctual terror. This was it. The moment Finn had warned her about. The failure of the cabin. The death of the fire. This was the deep cold, and it was inside with them now. There was no time for despair. Panic was a fire that consumed energy and offered no heat. Her mind, sharpened by weeks of preparation and a lifetime of listening to Finn's wisdom, became crystal clear. All her work, all the town's mockery, had led to this single, desperate moment. She grabbed the lantern, its flame a tiny, defiant star in the rapidly freezing dark. "Come, Fenrir," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the cold dread coiling in her stomach. It's time. She moved toward the strange wooden box in the center of the room. It no longer looked like a coffin. It looked like the only thing in the world that mattered. It was her ark in a frozen sea, the last pocket of hope in a world that had turned to ice. She had to move fast. The cold was already slowing her down, making her fingers stiff and her movements clumsy. They had only minutes before it would be too late. With numb fingers, Anya lifted the heavy, insulated lid of the box. The interior was a dark, welcoming void. She worked with a desperate efficiency, her actions a well-rehearsed dance. First, the blankets. She grabbed the thickest furs and woolens from her now useless bed and piled them inside, creating a deep, soft nest. Then, the small tin of provisions and the precious tallow candles. She urged Fenrir toward the opening. The dog, usually so obedient, hesitated, whining and looking back at the dying, freezing room that had been his home. The sheer wrongness of the cold, the violence of the wind now howling through the hole in the roof, had disoriented him. "In, boy," Anya commanded, her voice firm but gentle. "Get in." "We must." He seemed to understand the urgency in her tone. He clambered into the box, curling himself into the tightest possible ball in the far corner, his warm body immediately beginning to fight the chill of the wood. Anya followed, her limbs stiff and clumsy with cold. She slid in beside him, pulling the last of the blankets over them both. The space was incredibly tight, their bodies pressed together in the cramped darkness. For a moment, she lay there, the frigid air of the cabin still burning her face. Then, with the last of her strength, she reached up and pulled the heavy lid down. It settled into place with a soft, final thud, sealing them in. The world vanished. The screaming of the wind was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant, ghostly howl. The oppressive, aggressive cold of the cabin was replaced by a different kind of cold, a still, patient, enclosed chill. But it was a cold they could fight. They were no longer a small island in a large, freezing room, they were the sole occupants of their own tiny universe. The only light was the faint glow of the lantern she had left burning outside the box, a glow that was quickly fading. The only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart and the soft panting of the dog beside her. She pulled the wool blanket up to her chin, burying her face in Fenrir's thick fur. His body was a furnace, a living, breathing source of heat. Her own body, though chilled, was also generating warmth. In the tiny, enclosed space, their combined heat began to push back against the cold, creating a small, survivable pocket of air. It was a desperate, primal equation, two living beings against the absolute zero of the storm. Time dissolved. There was no day or night in the dark, cramped world of the box, only a slow, rhythmic cycle of consciousness. Anya would drift into a state of semi-sleep, a shallow torpor where dreams mixed with the reality of her cold limbs and the steady, reassuring weight of Fenrir beside her. Then she would surface, her mind clearing for a few moments, and she would assess their situation. The air grew thick with their breath, moist and warm. Condensation formed on the inside of the lid and froze, creating a delicate, sparkling ceiling of ice crystals above them. It was a sign that their tiny ecosystem was working, they were trapping their own warmth. A few times, she dared to light one of the tallow candles. She would hold it for only a few minutes, the small flame a miraculous bloom of orange in the absolute blackness. It provided a flicker of heat, but its true value was for her spirit. It was a defiant gesture, a reminder that they were still alive, still fighting. In the warm puddle of its light, she would break off a piece of dried venison for herself and a piece for Fenrir, there chewing the only sound in their silent world. The dog was her savior. His stoicism, his unwavering presence, kept the tendrils of despair at bay. When a tremor of shivering would rack her body, he would shift, pressing his body more firmly against hers, licking her cold face with his warm tongue. He was not just an animal, he was a partner in survival. Outside their wooden shell, the cabin became a monument to the storm's power. The interior was an ice palace. The spilled water from the bucket was a frozen waterfall. The stew left in the pot was a solid block. The frost on the walls was inches thick, sparkling with a deadly beauty. The wind continued its assault, piling snow against the cabin until it was almost completely buried, a small, insignificant mound in a vast, white wilderness. In town, a similar, though less absolute, fate was unfolding. Mr. Hemlock, huddled with his family and a few others in the back room of his store, had finally run out of furniture to burn. The cold in the mercantile was now almost as severe as it was outside. His bravado was long gone, replaced by a hollow, gnawing fear. He thought of Anya, the lone widow he had pitied and mocked. He imagined her frozen in her cabin, a victim of her own foolishness. The thought brought him no comfort, only a profound and terrible shame. He had been so certain of his own wisdom, and now his world had been reduced to this, a freezing room, a dying fire, and the fading hope of seeing the sun again. The first hint of change was the silence. The relentless, deafening roar of the wind, which had become the soundtrack to their existence, did not fade slowly, it simply stopped. The sudden absence of sound was as jarring as the noise had been. Anya, roused from a shallow doze, lay perfectly still, listening. The silence was profound, heavy, as if the entire world were blanketed in thick cotton. Fenrir stirred beside her, lifting his head, his ears twitching. Had the storm passed, or was this merely its eye, a brief, deceptive respite before a final, furious assault? Anya chose to wait. To open the box too soon would be a fatal mistake. They had enough provisions for another day, perhaps two. Their warmth was a finite, precious resource, not to be squandered. So they waited in the dark, listening to the silence. Hours passed. There were no new sounds, no resurgence of the wind. Anya could feel a subtle shift in the quality of the cold. It was still immense, but it no longer felt active and malevolent. It was now a passive, settled cold, the deep stillness of a world frozen in place. Finally, she made her decision. "All right, boy," she whispered, her voice a rough croak. "Let's see what's left of the world." With muscles stiff and aching, she pushed against the lid. It was heavy, heavier than before, and resisted her efforts. For a terrifying moment, she thought they were trapped, sealed in their tomb by a drift of snow. She pushed again, harder this time, using her back and legs. With a scraping groan, the lid moved, shifting a heavy weight. A sliver of light, so bright it was painful, pierced their darkness. She blinked, her eyes watering, and pushed again. The lid opened fully, and the light flooded in. It was the light of a world reborn in ice. The inside of her cabin was unrecognizable. Every surface was coated in a thick, glittering layer of hoarfrost. The air was perfectly still and so cold it felt like breathing powdered crystal. Icicles, thick as her arm, hung from the hole where the stovepipe had been. It was a place of breathtaking, lethal beauty. She carefully climbed out of the box, her legs unsteady beneath her. Fenrir followed, shaking his great body as if to shed the memory of their confinement. They were the only living, breathing things in the frozen tableau. Anya walked to the door and put her shoulder against it. It wouldn't budge. She pushed harder, and with a great heave, it scraped open just enough for her to squeeze through. The world outside was blinding white, silent, and utterly transformed. The snow was piled to the eaves of her cabin. The forest was gone, replaced by soft, rolling mounds of white, with only the very tops of the tallest pines visible, their branches heavy and caked with ice. The sun was out, a pale, distant disk in a sky of the purest, most unforgiving blue. The air was still, and the silence was absolute. It was the silence of a world holding its breath after a great trauma. Anya stood there for a long time, taking it all in. She was alive. Fenrir was alive. The box, Finn's final piece of wisdom, had saved them. She felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost dizzying, followed by a quiet, fierce surge of gratitude. She had listened. She had prepared. And she had survived. It took the better part of the day for the sounds of life to return. A shout, faint and far away. Then another. Slowly, Providence began to dig itself out. Doors were cleared, tunnels were carved through the immense drifts, and the survivors emerged, blinking in the bright, cold light, their faces etched with shock and loss. Not everyone had made it. The storm had been too long, the cold too deep. The community, once so confident and self-assured, was shattered, humbled, and afraid. Late in the afternoon, a figure appeared, struggling through the deep snow toward her cabin. It was Mr. Hemlock. He was a changed man. His expensive coat was torn, his face was gaunt and smudged with soot, and the arrogance had been scoured from his eyes, replaced by a look of haunted exhaustion. He stopped a few feet from her, staring at the broken stovepipe jutting from her roof, then at her, standing there, alive and whole. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he managed to stammer, "Your fire, it went out. We saw the smoke stop. We thought you were," he couldn't finish the sentence. "The fire went out," Anya agreed, her voice quiet. "But I was prepared for that." He looked from her to the cabin, his gaze uncomprehending. "How? How is that possible? We burned everything. My desk. The chairs. We almost didn't." His voice broke. Anya did not lead him inside to show him the box. She did not need to explain or to gloat. Her survival was its own statement. She simply looked at the mountain, its peak gleaming in the afternoon sun. "My husband taught me to listen," she said. "Not to the talk in town, but to the whispers of the earth." The mountain said the deep cold was coming. I chose to believe it. Mr. Hemlock stared at her, and in that moment, he finally understood. He saw not an eccentric widow, but a woman of profound and quiet wisdom. He had built his life on goods and coin, on confidence and commerce. She had built hers on listening, on humility, and on a simple wooden box. He had sold provisions. She possessed providence. As others from the town began to make their way toward her, drawn by the impossible sight of her survival, Anya went back inside. She emerged a moment later with a small tin of dried venison, offering a piece to the humbled merchant. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the frozen silence, a new community was about to be born, centered not around a store filled with goods, but around a small, quiet cabin, and the enduring warmth of a wisdom that had been patiently waiting to be heard.